What a fantastic panel we've got for you to discuss this now. You got both sides of it. First, let's listen to Poilievre here. Here he is asked about the CBC. Speaks very plainly here. Have a listen.
I will defund the CBC. This is a colossal waste of money, over $1 billion for a bloated corporation that is becoming increasingly just a communications bureau for the PMO. So I will defund CBC, and I will have specific policy proposals to achieve that.
Okay. Well, this is what he says. He says it over and over again. This is what he's going to do with the CBC. Let's discuss it now. Will he really do this? Should he do this? Let's discuss it. We got both sides of it now for you. Marla Boltman on the line. Marla is Executive Director, Friends of Canadian Media. Marla, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it a lot. And Chris Sims is also on the line, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Chris, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having us. All
right. Thank you to both of you. Marla, let me go to you first. I really appreciate your time on this today. So when you hear Poilievre make these threats here to defund the CBC, he says it over and over again. What goes through your mind? What do you think of that?
Well, I think what we should talk about first is, why is the CBC important to Canadians and why should the CBC be protected? I think we have to have that conversation before we talk about defunding it. Sure. And, I think the CBC matters to Canadians for two very important reasons. The first being that it bolsters our cultural independence and preserves our distinct identity by providing a platform for truly Canadian stories that would otherwise go untold, both at home and abroad. And I couldn't help but notice, Rush bringing us into this segment. There's a great Canadian music that places like the CBC and the protection of Canadian media, we don't have Rush without things like that. So this is as true today as it was almost a century ago when the CBC was first created in response to concerns about the growing influence of American content as US-based networks began expanding into Canada. And I'd say it's actually even more true today, given that the United States is unquestionably the most prolific and influential producer of news and entertainment content in the world. And second, the CBC provides independent and editorially rigorous journalism for all Canadians. It investigates issues, it scrutinizes politicians, it interprets the news of the day, all while serving as a watchdog for those in power and those with power, and it's all free to Canadians. Sadly, I think it's fair to say that we live in an era of misinformation and disinformation, where profits are found in providing people with news that actually drives them apart and denies them access to balance and facts and competing perspectives. And at Friends of Canadian Media, we think that high quality public broadcasting, which is provided by the CBC, it is the antidote. It helps promote transparency, accountability, and the development of a well-informed public, which is key to preserving a healthy democracy. So when you consider the immense cultural and democratic value that the CBC holds in this country, I think it's a nice to have. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have.
Okay, Marla making the case there to preserve the CBC. Chris Sims, what do you say?
Well, we differ, and that's okay. The CBC is long past due for being defunded. To get some numbers out there, so as of right now, the CBC costs taxpayers more than $1.4 billion per year with a B. To put that into perspective, that kind of money could otherwise pay the salaries of around 7,000 paramedics and 7,000 carpenters every single year. So that is what we are paying for the CBC. Further, we're seeing just such a disconnected bloat, especially at the top of the CBC. So for example, the CEO of the CBC, Catherine Tate, is paid between $400,000 per year and $620,000 per year. And even just this morning, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation announced that we have officially filed a complaint now with the federal government because the CBC is trying to hide what it is paying its executives in bonuses. So folks might remember back in January, it was really, I would say, unprecedented. I can't remember the last time I saw the CEO of the CBC grilled in front of the Heritage Committee. The CEO of the CBC was grilled in front of the Heritage Committee, and she was asked about bonuses. Why are you paying out $15 million this year in bonuses and who's getting them? The CEO didn't answer. And now, so we filed an access to information request, Mike, to find out who's getting that money. So for its top 8 executives, who's getting that bonus money and how much? They have filed a delay. The CBC has kicked the can ahead of time so that they won't have to be transparent at her committee meeting tomorrow. She's supposed to be on Parliament Hill tomorrow.
Okay, Marla, there continues to be a lot of criticism on this point about the executive bonuses there at CBC. How do you respond to that? Marla
Almost
Boltman.
everything the CBC does can be done in the marketplace these days because of technology. I would preserve a small amount for French language minorities, for linguistic minorities, because they, frankly, will not get news services provided by the market.
Okay, that's Polyev there saying that he would actually preserve some French language programming by the CBC, and I guess all the English language programming would be defunded. Marla Boltman, your thoughts on, you heard Chris there make the point about the executive bonuses there at CBC. It's a frequent criticism of CBC. What do you say to that? I guess, do we still have her? No. Okay, are you on mute, Marla? No?
It looks like she's on mute on my side, Mike.
Okay. Well, we'll try to fix this. But what would you say? Okay, Chris, just to go back to you while we sort Marla's
no problem.
Connectivity out there. When you hear Polyev there saying, "Well, yeah, we're going to,"
I'm here. Oh,
Marla, there you go.
Sorry.
Okay, Marla, go ahead.
Sorry, guys, there was a technical difficulty there.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I want to get back to a point that Chris just made about the bloat and the $1.4 billion. So first of all, I noticed in the defund CBC campaign that you're running, you used to talk about the nurses and the police that you could fund with that money, and now it's changed to paramedics and carpenters. And I assume that's in response to the fact that there is now more of a focus on healthcare and housing in this country. So
you can pick anybody who makes about $100,000 per year and slot them in there.
Okay.
So if you want to pick cops and nurses, that's fine. Plumbers and carpenters, that's fine too. It's very simple math.
Either way, I think that to say that we defund the public broadcaster so that we can fund more of these $100,000 a year employees is kind of disingenuous and is presenting a false choice. And I don't say that as a personal attack, because I actually think the bottom line is we can and should have both. We can have all of these things. We are a G7 country, one of the wealthiest in the world, and this doesn't have to be presented as a zero-sum game. So to come back now to your question about the bonuses being paid out, I would say that at Friends of Canadian Media, the failure to hit pause on the executive bonuses, it frustrated us and our supporters, and it seemed a bit out of touch. But I'm not about to defend the decision about the executive bonuses. I don't think it's our place to do so. And as Chris just pointed out, Catherine Tate is appearing at the Heritage Committee tomorrow afternoon. And I know that we're going to be listening closely to hear what she has to say.
Chris, go ahead. Your thoughts on that?
Just very quickly on comparing this to what people make. That's just in order to explain what $1.4 billion is. Because a lot of times once you get up to $1 billion, it's really kind of hard to understand. Like I could otherwise say that it could buy 2,400 homes in Calgary. You know what I mean? Like it's just understanding the scale of the numbers there. To the point on whether or not the CBC is required and on whether or not we would still have Rush, this is separate from Canadian content. All right. This is separate from SOCAN. It's even separate from Canada Council for the Arts, which we still fund by hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Specifically about the CBC, $1.4 billion per year, and the viewership is nosediving. And this is something that CEO Tate brought up last time she was there under questioning from members of parliament. About 1% of Canadians now, based on recent ratings, are watching their supper hour newscast. 1%. People are reaching out to other networks and other sources of entertainment to get things like their hockey score, their weather reports, their news, and their entertainment. And something that folks who defend spending this kind of money with the CBC like to bring up is Indigenous programming. Well, actually, the CBC spends about 0.3% of its annual budget on Indigenous programming.
Right, we continue our defund the CBC debate. This is the oft-repeated promise from Pierre Poilievre, the federal conservative leader. He would defund the public broadcaster. Got both sides right here for you. Marla Boltman, Friends of Canadian Media. Chris Sims, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Catherine Tate's name was mentioned, the president of the CBC. Let's listen to her testifying recently in front of a parliamentary committee defending the CBC here. Have a listen.
We are the most outstanding, high-quality journalistic organization in this country. And we are the only journalistic organization that has any level of presence internationally. And even then, it's rather inadequate. But we do that work with extraordinary care. Our purpose is the public interest, first and foremost.
That's the president of the CBC there, Catherine Tate. Marla, when you listen to this talk about defunding the CBC, and then you heard Poilievre there as well kind of qualify it and say, well, maybe we'll keep the French language programming. How do you analyze that? What do you think of that?
Well, we actually spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I would hope that your listeners and voters do too, because you know, what does defund the CBC mean? From where we're standing, it sounds a lot like, well, you know, prior to what you just played, you know, the end of one of the most important public institutions in this country. And that's a pretty big deal. But up until now, with the exception of, well, maybe we'll do this and maybe we'll do that, all we've heard are a bunch of slogans and chants. And I don't think Canadians are interested in casting their votes, their votes based on who has the best rallying cry. This isn't summer camp. They want to know what Poilievre actually plans on doing with the CBC. I think even those who would be happy to see it disappear want to know what the details look like. So if you talk about, well, maybe we'll just keep Radio Canada, I'd like to know how that works. So, you know, the CBC and Radio Canada is enshrined in the Broadcasting Act. We just went through the dance of C11 trying to change the Broadcasting Act to deal with foreign streamers. That took over 3 years. So how many years is it going to take to do whatever it is he plans to do to just fund Radio Canada and not fund English CBC? Is he going to split them apart, as we've been hearing now? Let's just go down that road if I can for a second. So let's say, okay, we'll keep English CBC and we'll separate it from Radio Canada, but we'll just fund Radio Canada. Well, I hate to break it to the supporters of Chris's groups here, but Radio Canada gets 44% of that $1.4 billion. Oh. So how much are you really saving if he keeps it? And I have one other question, which is how particularly our friends in the Western provinces, how are they going to feel about keeping 44% of that $1.4 billion to fund content only in French?
Okay, Chris, what do you say to that?
We want all of it eliminated. So as a line item in the budget, $1.4 billion, we want Pierre Poilievre to highlight that and get rid of it. Period. So if he wants to work out something with the Canadian Heritage Ministry in order to provide some sort of francophone language issue going on with folks who need access through federal government funding, that's a completely different ball of wax. But when it comes to actually defunding the CBC, we mean it. We want to see $1.4 billion worth of savings.
Is there...
And again, so for folks who keep on saying things like, oh, it's essential. How can it be essential if so few people are watching it? Like if a tree falls in the forest, then like that's the stage we're at here. And again, they often will go back to things like, oh, it provides essential services for new Canadians or for folks who are First Nations. That's not true. New Canadians have a plethora of options and different languages to reach broadcasting from through private media, through Omni, through Red FM, and First Nations folks, they can tune into APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, which gets a fraction of government funding. It's about 1.7 million with an M. So we have lots of options for these services, and people aren't tuning into the CBC.
As we get closer to running out of time, Marla, what do you say to that argument there around the ratings that Chris Sims says the ratings are very low? Your thoughts? He's got a minute left here.
I think there's a lot of different. There's lots of different ratings numbers that people are looking at to get the answers that they want to present. But I ask you the question, where does local news fit into all of this when we know that local CBC is one of the last media broadcasters left standing in local news? You talk about private media being an alternative. It's not an alternative. They've shown us time and time again that they will abandon local media. They already have on the print media front, and those local news deserts we're now seeing on the broadcast media front. And I would think that your supporters, a lot of them come from local communities, and they know better than anyone just how important local news is and what local news does and how it shines a spotlight on the stories in those communities. And I think that CBC provides a vital role in stopping the local news deserts that we're seeing and continuing to share news and high quality public broadcasting in those areas. Because when local news disappears, I just want to say this is a very important point. When those holes, when those deserts come and those holes come, the voids are filled by special interest groups, disinformation, and misinformation.